Hi, so today we're going to talk about energy flow through ecosystems. And energy starts with producers. Well, in fact, it starts from where producers get their energy from. And so examples of producers are plants. They produce their own food. And plants get their energy from the sun. So without a constant input of energy, living systems cannot function. So sunlight is the main energy source for all life on Earth. Sunlight gives its energy to plants, and plants can harness the sun's energy to produce their own food, and then animals can eat the plants to get their energy. So in a few ecosystems, some organisms obtain energy from a source other than sunlight. So for example, at the bottom of the ocean, there is no sunlight. So a lot of the organisms at the bottom of the ocean have to get their energy from somewhere else. They rely mainly on energy stored in inorganic chemical compounds, such as hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, water, and sugar. So only plants, some algae, and certain bacteria can capture energy from sunlight or chemicals and use that energy to produce food. These organisms are called autotrophs. I think automatically make their own food. So they can automatically make their own food. They can just get the energy from the sunlight. They use the energy from the environment to fuel the assembly of simple inorganic compounds into complex organic molecules. These organic molecules combine and recombine to produce living tissue. And we'll see this in a minute with photosynthesis. Plants can take energy from the sun plus some inorganic compounds like carbon dioxide, and they can produce all of the macromolecules needed for life, like proteins and carbohydrates. So because they make their own food, autotrophs are also called producers. They produce their own food. So an example is a plant. It's an organism capable of synthesizing its own food from inorganic substances using light or chemical energy. So energy from the sun. The best known autotrophs harness solar energy through a process known as photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, these autotrophs use light energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and energy-rich carbohydrates. So photosynthesis is responsible for adding oxygen to and removing carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere. So they capture light energy, carbon dioxide, and water to make their own food source, their own energy source, like carbohydrates. Same as we use carbohydrates for energy, so do they. They just make their own carbohydrates. We have to consume our carbohydrates. So plants are the main autotrophs on land. Plants. Algae is the main autotroph in freshwater ecosystems and in upper layers of the ocean. So algae here. And photosynthetic bacteria are important in certain wet ecosystems such as tidal flats and salt marshes. So this is a salt marsh, and the dark green cyanobacteria in the pool, these are bacteria. It's not algae, it's actually bacteria. So some autotrophs can produce food in the absence of light. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So when organisms use chemical energy to produce carbohydrates, the process is called chemosynthesis. So photosynthesis, the photo means light. They make light essentially. This means they make compounds from chemicals. Chemosynthesis is performed by several types of bacteria. These bacteria represent a large proportion of living autotrophs. So down at the bottom of the ocean, there's these hydrothermal vents or deep sea vents that release all of these chemicals into the ocean. And these bacteria that live by these hydrothermal vents can actually take the chemicals coming up through these vents and produce energy. So hydrogen sulfide and oxygen combine, forming sulfur compounds. This is the chemical energy needed for the cells to make carbohydrates using carbon dioxide from the seawater. So this is chemosynthesis in sulfur bacteria. Some chemosynthetic bacteria live in very remote places on Earth, such as volcanic vents on the deep ocean floor and also in hot springs. Others live in more common places, such as tidal marshes along the coast. If you've ever been to Yellowstone National Park, those bubbling hot pits that smell like rotten eggs, those are actually sulfur bacteria. They actually are chemosynthetic bacteria. They're converting the hydrogen sulfide into actual sulfur compounds, which is what you smell. So they're taking hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, and water, and they're producing this sulfur compound and sugar. So consumers cannot make their own food. We can't just go out and sunbathe and make our own energy. We actually have to consume our food or eat our food. So we can't directly harness energy from the light. So organisms that rely on other organisms for their energy and food supply are called heterotrophs. They get hetero, it means different. They have to get their energy from different sources other than the sun. They're also called consumers because they consume their food, like the squirrel is consuming this nut. There are many different types of heterotrophs. You've heard of some of these, I'm sure. Herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat animals, omnivores, which are, most humans are omnivores. We eat both plants and animals. Detritivores feed on plant and animal remains and other dead matter. They're basically also known as scavengers. And decomposers, like bacteria and fungi, break down organic matter. So they break down dead organic matter. So there's feeding relationships between consumers. We know this. We eat plants and animals. So we have a feeding relationship between plants and animals. The relationships between producers and consumers connect organisms into a feeding networks based on who eats whom. Energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction, from the sun or inorganic compounds to autotrophs, which are producers, and then to various heterotrophs, or consumers. So the sun is the ultimate source, giving energy to producers. Producers then get eaten by consumers. When consumers die, they get decomposed, and they go back into the inorganic nutrient pool to be picked up by producers again. But the energy flow flows from the sun to producers to consumers. Food chains. A food chain is a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by eating and being eaten. It is one simple step in the feeding system. So the grass transfers its energy to the grasshopper because the grasshopper eats the grass. The snake eats the grasshopper. Therefore, the snake is getting the energy from the grasshopper. That's why the arrow goes in this direction. Then the snake gives its energy to the hawk because it gets eaten by the hawk. And then when the hawk dies, fungi decomposes it and the nutrients go back to the grass. So in some marine food chains, the producers are microscopic algae and the top carnivore is 4 steps removed from the producer. So algae get eaten by zooplankton, which get eaten by small fish, which get eaten by squid, which get eaten by sharks. Food webs, on the other hand, are a little bit more complex. They show many food chains in one step. So ecologists describe the feeding relationship in an ecosystem that forms a network of complex interactions known as a food web. A food web links all of the food chains in an ecosystem together. So this food web shows some of the feeding relationships in a salt marsh community. So you'll notice it's not just one step to the other. It's not one feeding relationship. The sandhopper can get its food from different organisms, from the detritus and from the marsh grass. The marsh hawk doesn't just eat one thing. It eats different types of birds and even a mouse. So it shows all of the feeding relationships in the ecosystem. So when we talk about feeding relationships, we're actually talking about trophic levels. Each organism is on a different level. So each step in the food chain or food web is called a trophic level. Producers make up the first trophic level, always. We always start with the producers. Consumers make up the second, third, or higher trophic levels. Each consumer depends on the trophic level below it for energy. So here's the first trophic level, producers. Then the second is primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and sometimes you can go all the way up to quaternary consumers. Ecological pyramids show many different things. So the amount of energy or matter in an ecosystem can be represented by an ecological pyramid. An ecological pyramid is a diagram that shows the relative amounts of energy or matter contained within each trophic level in a food chain or food web. Generally, it's shown as a pyramid because the most energy generally comes from the producers, the bottom level. That's why it's the largest step in the pyramid. And then at the highest level, you have the least amount of energy. So as you go up from producers to herbivores to predators to higher level predators, or primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers, you have less and less energy. And we're going to talk about why that is. So there are 3 different types of ecological pyramids. There's energy pyramids, biomass pyramids, and pyramids of numbers. An energy pyramid shows the relative amount of energy available at each trophic level. Only part of the energy is stored in one trophic level is passed to the next level. So believe it or not, only 10% of the energy is actually transferred between levels. Most of the energy that you consume in your everyday life is not stored in you to be eaten by someone else. It's actually used up, and you use this energy and you release this energy as heat energy. So you can kind of think of it like when you're exercising, you're consuming all the energy that you actually ate. You're using up all of that energy, and that energy is leaving you as heat energy. So at each level, you're only keeping 10% of the energy from the previous level. If we start at 100% energy at the producer level, first level consumers or primary consumers only have 10% of the energy, then 1%, then 0.1 as you go up. The more levels that exist between a producer and top-level consumer in an ecosystem, the less energy that remains from the original amount. Only about 10% of the energy is available within one trophic level is transferred to the organisms at the next trophic level. In a biomass pyramid, it shows the total amount of living tissue within a given trophic level. This is called biomass, literally living mass. Biomass is usually expressed in terms of grams or organic matter per unit area. A biomass pyramid represents the amount of potential food available for each trophic level in an ecosystem. So it's basically like weighing all of the living matter in an area to figure out how much food there actually is. So biomass represents the amount of living organic matter at each trophic level. Typically, the greatest biomass is at the base of the pyramid, and that's definitely true for rainforests. So 5,000 grams of grain, 500 grams of chicken, 50 grams of human. Generally, it's also only 10% transferred to each level. Pyramids of numbers shows the relative number of individual organisms at each trophic level. So if you were to go into a rainforest and count the number of organisms, that would give you a pyramid of numbers. Shows the relative number of individual organisms at each level. So how many plants are there? How many primary consumers? How many secondary? How many tertiary in one area? That is pyramid of numbers. For some ecosystems, the shape of the pyramid of numbers is the same as that of the energy and biomass pyramids. However, in ecosystems where there are fewer producers than there are consumers, such as a forest ecosystem, the pyramid of numbers would not resemble a typical pyramid at all. And that is all for today. Thanks for watching.